Welcome to Courtyard Conversations. I'm your host, Douglas Gutierrez. And with me today, I have a very special guest, the one and only Dr. Marcela Nava. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being with us. Today's topic is twofold. We're going to be speaking on Women's History Month and Social Work Month.
Okay.
Let's get right into the program.
Let's do it.
What core values of social work do you think are most critical for students to carry into their future practice?
Man, you kind of feel like we should just be walking around, right, with the values printed out with us every day. I think it's a difficult time right now, and so I think one of the really important things to think about is really, the first thing that comes to mind is when you say that is the dignity of the person.
Okay.
It's a time where, as a profession, as a society, uh, there's kind of an identity crisis, I think, happening at multiple levels and practice and academia, and politics and policy. And a lot of that is causing sometimes, knee jerk reactions to carry out business as usual or to continue down paths or to, really focus on continuing, to be a voice for others. But I think what's being missed in a lot of those spaces and, what I would just really hold up as a core value is how many people, as much as we, as a profession and as a practice, really want to take the lead and really feel compelled to take the lead, there are so many people who are voiceless and who have been silenced in a lot of the environment that we find ourselves in. That oftentimes, the louder that social work profession speaks, the less capable we are of hearing the voices and really standing um, next to the voices of people that are really struggling at this time. So I think thinking about the dignity of the individual with dignity as just this really core value of understanding that sometimes individuals have very limited capacity to influence what's happening in them around them. They have limited capacity to change the policies and the politics and the environment. But to be able to exercise some level of basic control over their life, to have some level of voice and some level of decision making in what occurs to them is one
Mm.
of the most empowering things that can occur to somebody. So I think dignity of the individual and understanding how sometimes we just need to be quiet and really learn how to support communities rather than feeling like, compelled to take the lead.
When you mention dignity of the individual, are you speaking on the individual of the receiver, the one the social work profession is wanting to benefit, or the sender, the ones in social work?
The dignity of the individual, even that idea, right, of the sender, of the receiver, creates this idea that social workers are providing a service to individuals that are this kind of passive recipient of things, versus this idea of the social workers as collaborators that work with people who have
Hmm.
autonomy, who have agency, who have a voice. And oftentimes, we again because we're so, and not that it's a, negative thing. Obviously, like, our profession really calls us to step in and be a voice
Yeah.
and take on leadership.
Yeah.
But when social work voices are heard before the voices of the individuals being affected, or when they're heard, when there's
Mm.
not a deliberate and conscious effort to partner with people and make sure that their voices are heard, and to use our voices to carry out their messages rather than carrying out what we think should happen to them, I think that's really where you see a violation of the dignity of the individual.
Okay. So in for someone who's not particularly within the social work profession, the way I'm hearing that message is communicate the problem or the issue, then provide a solution versus providing a solution first that sort of dictates the narrative of, well, this is what you need versus this is what I'm responding to.
I would say even before is just listen, right? Like,
Okay.
there's oftentimes a sense of urgency that comes around in times like this, of we need to act, we need to react.
Hmm.
And one of the difficult things to sit with is the acute discomfort and frustration, and, like I said, identity crisis, right? Of
Mm.
individuals that have created a career out of trying to help others and help communities, to then be in an environment where so much of that is being challenged on so many levels. But what I find is that sometimes it is that urgency to respond that is where some of the greatest harms can occur unwittingly, right? Because there's
Okay.
the urgency to respond is part of what
Mm-hmm.
some of the kind of greater happenings, cause. And so that urgency to respond, that urgency to react sometimes leads to people speaking and proposing solutions and taking leads versus just really pausing and sitting and listening, really listening to the communities being impacted. And honestly, really sitting and trying to understand how we got to where we got this today, right? There's social work
Okay.
has,
Yeah.
because of the social, justice narrative, there's oftentimes, I think, a temptation to position social work as, the good and versus the evil, right? And to a lot of the issues that we study, we try to position ourselves as the solution and the persons that are advancing social justice. And that tends to create this dichotomy where I find, again, this is kind of my thoughts and perspectives after doing this for several years, is that it creates sometimes a hesitation to really reflect on, well, what is this other side? Like, what is there? Are there things that we've done as a profession or in the
Mm-hmm.
spaces that we've moved in that have contributed to some of this animosity? Are there things where we
Mm.
reacted and we behaved in a way that was polarizing? Have we, pointed and accused fingers and reduced people down to their ideology, much the same way that we accuse them of doing with us? So I think there's a lot of necessity to think about the dignity of not just the people that, again, that we want to help as a profession, but the dignity of the individuals that we disagree with, the individuals of the people that are, may hold very opposing values, but they are still
Hmm.
individuals. And to reduce them down to their ideology and to position them as the immoral, side, regardless of political, values, is violates their dignity as well, and is also a missed learning opportunity to really understand how can we do better, right? Because I think that leads to kind of a closed-mindedness of saying, no, we're the righteous, we're the good, we're the solid, we're the social justice champions. Let's just keep fighting and moving forward.
Hmm.
But you know what? Like, we're not perfect. We're not perfect. And we should stop and, shut up sometimes and just be quiet and listen and really reflect on, how we can share. I'm not saying take all of the accountability,
Mm.
but share in some of the accountability of kind of this greater chaos that we find ourselves in as a society.
Wow. I think that is a very mature and almost broader viewpoint of the entire context of the situation. As I'm listening, I'm immediately thinking, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, the narrative of, well, there's this fire happening. Let's just come in with a bucket of water with good intention,
Right.
but sometimes intention or action, though can be connected, there are two intensities and extremes of the spectrum. In me throwing this bucket of water on the fire, wanting to put it out, I've then created more smoke and
Mm,
added to the destruction that the fire is currently making.
interesting analogy. Yeah.
Yeah, I also think about in this mature position of not necessarily siding with the quote unquote villain, but giving them that opportunity to hear them out because maybe we are missing something. Maybe in our profession as social workers, we've kind of become, and I hope I'm using this word correctly, hubris in thinking that what we're doing 100% is right.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, it
Absolutely.
it also makes me think about, I heard this quote that I think the correct term is lumberjack. If a lumberjack has 6 hours to cut down a tree,
Mm,
he takes 4 to sharpen the axe.
mm,
So instead of just immediately responding, let's prepare. Let's gather our thoughts. Let's make sure that in our attempt to do something, all we need is one shot. We don't need 2, 3 shots to take down the foe. We can do it in one. Is that more or less kind of what you're describing is come at it with everything as perfect? I don't maybe not use the word perfect, but as effective and optimal as it could be to then accomplish this task?
mm. I'm sitting here thinking of the lumberjack example. It sounds like
Yeah.
something my dad would
Yeah.
say, like a story. Yeah, I mean, I think definitely thinking along those lines. You know, the what comes to mind right now is, I was having a conversation uh, with a former student, who's now in practice, and she reaches out occasionally, and we'll kind of check in, kind of do a mentorship meeting.
Yeah.
And she had reached out to me and just said, I'm struggling, with this was, right after the election,
Okay.
the last presidential election, and she was really struggling. And we had the most interesting conversation. And so she's telling me this story of going to a friend's wedding and sitting down and having a conversation with the friend's husband. And it turned
Okay.
out that the friend's husband had voted for Trump. And this was, again, social work doesn't, fall within political spaces, but of course we know that everything's politicized in this environment.
Mhm.
And so she's in this wedding, right? She's in this very public, she's been this very, intimate social space where I feel like, in most other situations, she would have kind of found a way to, get away from this individual or not have a conversation. But this was the person her friend had just married, right? So she ends up sitting down and having this conversation with him. And so when she's talking with me, it was so interesting because her reaction wasn't, oh, I'm so angry. I can't believe what he did. Da, da, da. It was this internal conflict that she had in herself, which was, he's nice and he's reasonable. And he actually was able to have a conversation with me. And I'm struggling because I could kind of, not saying I agreed with him, but I could kind of understand where he was coming
see
from.
where he's coming from.
Right. And so she was having this internal struggle. And we had this great conversation. And I think kind of how we ended up kind of breaking it down is that she felt that, a big part of her training had kind of compelled her to really have very strong feelings about some of the values or some of the policies that this person she was talking with had. But then she also recognized him as a human. She recognized him as a human who had had certain experiences that had led to certain beliefs and certain values. And so even though she, may have, disagreed and continued to disagree with him in several ways, she saw him as a human. And so she could no longer really villainize him. Right. So she was now forced to engage with him as a human with depth, with emotions, and not simply kind of write him off as, oh, a Trump supporter. Da, da, da. Right. And so I think it was such a good example of how it's, again, as tempting as it is to want to jump and react and continue, there are so many missed opportunities, and in doing so, what we end up doing is essentially create, reacting in the same way that we then villainize others, right? If we are a profession that stands for values where we want to, fight against racism and we want to fight against different forms of oppression, to then reduce an individual and villainize them, or reduce a group of individuals and villainize them based on a belief or a value or a political vote, is in many ways creating the same type of dynamics that we claim to stand against. And so, again, I think there's a lot of individuals that really hold on to their values as their sense of righteousness. And I think that what's happening is that a lot of that's shaken up for people, and that core of just that direction of, I knew what I was doing and I knew I was doing it, and now I don't know what I'm doing and I don't know why I'm doing it, has really shaken up a lot of people. And so, my kind of thing is not that that's a good thing or a bad thing, but that it's a learning opportunity. If
I like the framing.
it's a learning opportunity.
Yeah, I like the framing. One of my follow-up questions I wanted to ask was, is there a case where what you see is what you get? This is how this person is displaying themselves. This is their core beliefs. This is their ethos and logos. And you can label it as something as evil. It's agreed upon that they're this way. It's known that they're this way. This person has even outright and said that they're this way. What approach should you give somebody like that? Like, I know you wanted to give them, still the room. You're human. I'm going to talk to you. But if they're just outright evil, a bad person, you're a bad apple, why should you deserve my dignity to even speak to you as a human when you clearly don't see me as a human is I guess I'm answering my own question now that I'm thinking about it. I'm into Stoicism.
Yeah.
I read a lot of philosophy. And one of the quotes from the philosophers, I don't know which one at the moment, but the quote is, "The greatest revenge is to not be like your enemy."
Interesting. Yeah.
So is this more of a,
You're going into some deep philosophy
yeah,
now.
yeah, yeah. Is this more of a destroy hate with love kind of approach? Or how are you, help me understand
Right.
what you're wanting to
So I'm
say?
going to push back a little bit on just the dichotomy of love and hate and
Okay.
good and evil. 'Cause one of the things that social work that characterizes social work, especially social work in the West, is the influence of Christianity. So if we think about
Okay.
Christianity and the influence of Christianity in the West versus different faiths and philosophy systems in other parts of the world, a lot of social work kind of ends up adopting, even though it's obviously not. It's a profession that's separate from Christianity. It's inevitable. A lot of the history of social work is really deeply embedded. A lot of social work practice is done in faith-based organizations. So this dichotomy of good and evil, of heaven and hell, is something that is much more typical of Christian religions. And this
Hmm.
idea of heaven on earth and the idea that there is the possibility of creating and working towards a state of goodness is also kind of a Christian idea. And it's such it's an idea that's so embedded into our society, so Western society and Western culture, that I
Mhm.
think one that it's so hegemonic that we kind of take it for granted. But if you think kind of alternately of the idea that there is no such thing as good and evil, or actually alternately that good and evil is just embedded in all of us. We are all good and we are all evil, and it is
Hmm.
impossible to separate that. And rather than thinking of this idea of a world where we can work towards a state of goodness and continual improvement, a lot of other faiths really look at life as a cycle. And so I think when you really
Okay.
look, part of what really motivated me to get into public policy is because of just my frustration with what I saw as really the lack of progress that a lot of social work interventions kind of were advancing. And so if you look at public policy and you look at, again, the evidence of how things happen, you don't see this state where people organize and they advance social justice and things improve, and there's eventually a state of where of equitable distribution of resources. You see a pendulum. You see a state where there's progress made in one space and then there's pushback, and then you may take two steps backward.
Naturally. Yeah.
You see cycles.
Mhm.
And you don't have like a clear good or bad parties. Even some of the most progressive policies that we hold up as things that benefit groups of people can have really negative long-term impacts in other areas of economy and politics. So again, there's no evidence that a lot of the ideas that we hold ourselves to of this kind of continued progress, that's actually possible. The evidence that exists is that things happen in cycles, and that there's kind of a pendulum effect, and there are negotiations that occur. And so this idea of good and evil, and there being groups that are evil and there being groups that are good and righteous, is kind of a religious artifact that, again, that I think that we can have an opportunity to really reflect. Is
Mhm.
that a way of, continuing to advance the profession? Or is there an opportunity to think about the profession as being part of this system and being flawed and having challenges, and in some ways contributing to oppressive systems, and, being kind of a colonial artifact? And again, just we're not good and we're not evil. We're both. How can we better comprehend that and just be grounded in that?
I think I use good and evil synonymously with benefit and detriment, meaning I think I'm understanding what you're saying in terms of good and evil don't exist because they're sort of happening at the same time all at once. And what I mean by that is something that's benefiting you is detrimental to me.
Not necessarily, right? So the same idea of good and evil is part of what creates, and I'm not saying that this is, the end all be all kind of way, but it's a perspective to really sit
Mm.
with. So think of the way we often think about capitalism and talk about the role of capitalism and the way that it impacts individuals, right? Oftentimes there's a lot of documented harm that has occurred in terms of distribution of wealth and in terms of limits to equitable distribution of resources and the ways that political and economic systems have created that. So oftentimes there's this resistance of this is evil, the evil capitalists, evil businesses, and the kind of righteous public sector and the righteous nonprofit sector. But the evidence shows that the public sector and the nonprofit sector functions honestly really similarly as the business sector, right? Like there's very practically in terms of evidence of who donates more or who has better outcomes, the evidence really doesn't hold up that there is a stronger, compelling value of goodness and, mission adherence in the public and the nonprofit sector. So rather than thinking of things in this good and evil kind of dynamic, again, like I think it's the opportunity here is to reflect, are there win-win situations? When you think about business opportunities, people that sit down to do business together, they don't have each other's best interest at heart. They have their own interest at heart.
Primarily.
Right? Primarily.
Like
their
initially,
their self-interest, right? And they sit down and they figure out, I want to get rich or I want to do well. You want to do well. How can we do this together in a way that we both benefit, right? That's kind of one of the core psychological tenets of capitalism. So one of the things that I've really been talking about in the classroom and in the community is how can we as social workers, as a profession, adopt some of that mentality as well. And that doesn't mean that we have to go in and think of how can I as an individual benefit from this, but realistically, like we're making a living doing this, right? Like we want to get paid doing this. And if it is in our self-interest to ensure that we carry out our job to the best of our profession and adhere to our values to the best that we can, then why can't we sit down and look for win-win situations with people? And rather than see them as the enemy or see them as evil or see them as oppressive, why can't we adopt, again, a more nuanced understanding of all of us as really complex systems and groups and individuals? And if we can find some mutually beneficial opportunities, we have a better chance of actually advancing some of the things we stand for. Because again, the issue becomes we can either make progress, which requires us to sit down with people that we may, and look at things in a different way, or we can stay grounded and self-righteous in our values while other people make progress and while groups struggle. And where, again, like it almost becomes very performative, right? Our values and the way that we hold things. But it's if you're putting more effort into looking righteous and sounding righteous and reacting in righteous ways,
chances
than
are
actually
you're
making
not.
progress,
Yeah.
are you in fact an effective social worker, or are you an effective social value signaler and are therefore using your profession for that? So,
May I challenge you?
always.
I agree that it would be optimal if we could both benefit. In this scenario, I know it may not be helpful to go to extremes, but for the sake of my example, I'm not interested in your benefit. I don't want to work with you.
Cool. I don't expect you to.
Pitch me your idea of this is how we can do this mutually when I don't even give you the ears to even want to work with you.
Right. That's the thing. I don't need to sell you an idea. My question to you is, what do you want?
I want me to make all the money.
Cool.
I don't want you to make a dime. It's an extreme example,
Right.
but I don't want you to make a dime. Like I could care less if your business or endeavors,
Your program or the community that you're
I could
working
care
with.
less.
I don't need you to care. Now, if you're actively opposed to sitting down with me, then I mean that the conversation doesn't initiate, right? But I think that's why a lot of the times in having these conversations, the first step isn't how do we get to where we want to go, but is there something we can agree on? Everybody has some point of agreement, right? So if we can sit down and figure out where's our agreement, we may not, we may both agree that we don't like the way public dollars are being spent. Maybe I think that there should be more funding. Maybe you think there should be less. Maybe I believe that this group should have more access to healthcare. Maybe you believe they should have less or none at all, right? But if we agree that this isn't working, And if we look for that point of agreement, then we're capable of listening to each other and having a conversation. And I think it's important, again, to understand that the solution may not be there, right? We may not be able to find a solution right away, but if we can just keep the windows of communication open, right? We continue to humanize each other.
How do you
and
keep
that
that?
is by finding some shared ground, right? Agreeing on what can we agree on as a problem. Maybe we disagree on the solution, but if we can at least agree that this is a problem, we've now found some common ground.
Okay.
And that
Yeah.
conversation provides an opportunity where we can return to it when other circumstances align. And a lot of the times, the solution isn't going to come about until there's a window of opportunity or until there's an event that we can capitalize on. But at least it provides us with some common ground that we can return back to.
That's a starting point. We've agreed that this is an issue. Another issue has raised that's caused me to place more value in it. So now the initial issue we both agreed on, I no longer have interest in it.
Yeah.
How do you bring me back there?
I don't need to bring you back there. But I think, again, the idea sometimes is some conversations you just have to let go.
Okay.
If it's not the opportunity or the time,
okay.
It's not. Maybe we can circle back later, right? But continue to try to force something to happen again. There's I think that's again part of where a lot of this happens. Is sometimes a lot of people will come to me and ask, I've done a lot of work trying to understand immigration policy and immigration spaces, and I've had a lot of people reach out to me over the years saying, "Hey, here's this situation, this really complex case of this individual. They're really great human, and it's they've done everything they can. Where are the resources to help them with this, this, and this?" And a lot of times my response is, there are none, right? There is no legal or political or financial recourse that's going to allow this person to advance in the way that you want them to. The best thing that they can do right now is to stay safe, right? And minimize any further harm. So that idea of sometimes there is no path, there is no solution in the time frame that you want with the person that you want, that's again one of those other lessons that we kind of have to think about, and really kind of acknowledging and accepting that a lot of the solutions that we look for are simply, may not occur, or they may occur in different ways, or they may come about, at a very kind of minimal incrementalist. But this idea that we're perpetually going to be improving and looking for things to be better is not always realistic. Sometimes we just kind of have to see things for the way they are and figure out, what role can we take there that still aligns with our values.
Are you into Stoicism by chance? Or in retrospect, like philosophy?
I've done my share of going down the rabbit hole of reading. I wouldn't necessarily say I align with a specific philosophy. I would probably just call myself a pragmatist, whatever's going to be the practical mindset for the challenge at hand.
Could you repeat that word?
Pragmatist.
Pragmatist. I've heard that before.
Yeah.
And it's one who chooses, I guess, the best model for them.
It's going to be whatever fits the solution. So, maybe we can, a philosophical framework might work for one approach. I may get into, more of a Buddhist mindset, for a different type of issue. I may lean into, some very specific values for something else, but it's really more like what's
optimal,
what's going to fit to get me to where I need to be. Right. And so what framework, what philosophy, what lens, what perspective is going to fit to get there.
Yeah. There's another Stoic quote that in your path towards this goal or towards completing this task, that the obstacles in your way become the very path and part of the path that you need to take. So if I want to get to here to from point A to point B, point A12 is in the way, but little did I know what I've learned and gathered through meeting and contacting this obstacle has now led me to appreciate differently or even come in a better position of reaching point B. So that's kind of what I'm saying. That's kind of what I was thinking as you were saying. Sometimes it's, acceptance that there is no solution, but in me figuring that out now saves me more time, more headache, more resource, more manpower to then do something else with my time.
Yeah. There was I was having a conversation with a student just last week, and we were talking a little bit about, like some of their frustrations with social work. And this was in a class where, we're talking a lot about policy.
Mm-hmm.
And again, there's a lot of kind of professional identity crisis, I think, happening right now around people, like how can I be learning about policy and how to improve and advocate when this is what's happening?
Fair.
And what I, caught myself saying was, sometimes as, again, social workers, if you really lean into, again, some of those kind of more Eastern philosophies, and even just some of kind of what we look at in terms of like mindfulness, sometimes all we have is this moment and this interaction. So if you're a social worker that's in a space that's practicing and you find yourself being overwhelmed because the interventions that you've been trained in are not effective, or there's so many other barriers and obstacles you didn't think about, if you can maybe just pull it back and, and I'm a strong believer that in all of the years that I've been doing, that I've either practiced or taught or done research, where I feel I've made the most impact on another individual's life is when I've just been present as a human and been able to hear them and their experience and been able to validate them through my own. So if we just see ourselves as having the really cool opportunity, if nothing else, and not to say that we throw away all of the hard, research and developed interventions, and that, but if we just see ourselves, if nothing else, we have the opportunities to be around people going through all kinds of experiences. And if all we can do is just be present with them and respect their dignity and validate their experiences, and just understand that being overwhelmed with all of the future and the obstacles and the goal planning sometimes pulls us away from the only thing that we know for certain, which is this moment
right now
and this interaction.
Maybe this is me kind of projecting my own thinking, but I would argue that the present moment is all we have.
Absolutely.
The past, we can't change. The future will forever be uncertain. You can funnel it with, certain parameters, but it's still unknown. There's a lot of possibilities for it. Mm-hmm. For the sake of time, I'm going to split, because we are still on question one. I'm going to split these last two questions, one for Social Work Month and one for Women's History Month.
Sure.
I think you sort of answered this one already, but I want to give you an opportunity to package it in the way you want to and deliver the message. What skills do you believe social work students must develop now to effectively work across sectors and systems in an increasingly complex policy landscape?
Skills. So we talked about this a little bit, but the skills is to really be able to sit down, to come in with I'm going to call it a business lens, right? This mutually beneficial lens.
I like it.
And really be able to sit down with individuals and think practically, right? And be able to communicate and humanize and understand, I don't need you to share the same values as me. I don't need you to care about the same groups that I care about. I don't need you to have the same interests. Mm-hmm. I just need to be able to find a way to communicate and find some shared ground. So the ability to not need to be the righteous one, right? To not need to be the good one.
I like
and
it.
To sit down and understand it's so complex and it's so nuanced. And if we want to be, we can either be righteous or we can be effective, right? And it's a time to be effective.
I like that one.
Right? So sitting down, and that takes a big dose of humility. It takes a big dose of self-reflection. Mm-hmm. It takes a lot of introspection. It takes a lot of asking for help and accepting help for your own challenges, and allowing yourself to have that human perspective that you can use to approach others as humans. That ability to find mutually beneficial solutions, find some common ground, and do so in a way that doesn't create this dichotomous good versus evil kind of approach.
I love it. Well said. Looking at your career, what moments stand out as defining in finding your voice as a scholar, practitioner, and a leader?
Ooh. Finding my voice as a scholar, practitioner, and a leader.
Hit you in the feels a little bit, huh?
It does, yeah. Yeah. I don't know if it's any one particular moment, but there are multiple small moments that repeatedly remind me why I do what I do, even with the frustrations of a given institution or the profession or it's happening. And those are the conversations that I have with people before class or after class or out in the community, where it's not about the theory that we talked about, right? And it's not about, an intervention that they practiced in, but it's simply about something that they see in me that they connect with. So there's moments that, again, I talk a lot about being a first generation American, first generation college student, and I've had multiple students come up to me and say, "You're the first, Latina. You're the professor that I've ever had. You're the first, first gen professor I've ever had." So to have those moments where I know, oh, you see yourself reflected in me, right? Which is something I never had as
Like
a
a
student.
model, right?
It's validated, right?
Okay.
I can inhabit this space. This is a space for me, right? Because growing up the way I did with immigrant parents or not U.S. citizens, don't speak English, are not very well integrated into U.S. society, the message that I still struggle with sometimes is, I don't belong, right? You don't belong. This isn't for you. This isn't our place. And so to be able to validate that for people, I also talk pretty openly with students about my own struggles with mental health, my own struggles with my behavioral health. I talk about what my different paths to recovery have been, and I talk about how I integrate, different things into that. So to have, I've had students message me on Teams late at night. I'm having, this intense struggle, and I don't know who to talk with. And I remember you mentioned that you were in recovery and that this is something you can relate to.
Yeah.
Could you talk with me about this? And to be able to be that voice for people and have them see that somebody with a PhD, with the title professor, that works at a university is just as human and just as flawed and has just as many struggles, but is still willing to continue to show up and be there. I think that's, again, those are my favorite moments where I'm reminded that I'm not here to represent a profession or represent a university. I'm here to represent humanity. And if these are the pathways that allow me to do that, then that's awesome. I love that, right? But I'm here to exist, and in existing, to allow others to feel and see, feel seen and feel validated through my existence.
I love it. There's almost a humility aspect to it where you place this person so high, but yet you remember they are human and they relatively started in the same place you're in now. I like it. Well, Dr. Nava. Marcela. I like calling. I didn't grow up with a lot of Latinos who were doctors, so I think we talked about this before. I like knowing that I work with colleagues with PhDs, so I intentionally call people doctor. But if you prefer Marcela, I'll call you Marcela. Wonderful conversation. Thank you again for your time. Thank you for squeezing this courtyard conversations into your day. If you look beneath your couch, we have a little gift for you as a token of our appreciation. And again, if you want to, it'd be nice to catch it on camera. Right on there. We got you some swag.
Oh, I got some swag, y'all.
Yeah. Nice little goodies in there.
Ooh.
I didn't get swag my last episode,
You didn't get some swag?
No, but I work here, so.
Oh, you got me a coffee cup.
I'm
never have
sure.
enough.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah. But again, thank you again for your time.
Yeah.
Thank you for your expertise and sharing your knowledge and perspectives on these issues and these topics. I wish you well in your personal and professional development, and we can't wait to see all the cool things you're going to do in your future.